All right, so today we're going to be looking at a DBQ from the Cold War. And it's important today as we talk about context to remember what leads up to the Cold War. So remember, right after World War II, we had the Americans, the British, the French are able to defeat the Germans and Japanese. But very quickly, everyone is able to see that the next problem is going to be with the Russians. Okay, so the United States and the Russians are obviously not going to get along here, and the main reason is kind of ideology, right? The Russians are communist. They want communism to spread. If you guys remember from world history, the end of the Communist Manifesto is workers of the world unite. It's not, hey, workers of our own little country unite, or hey, this group of factory workers unite. It's workers of the world unite. And the people in the West, Americans, were really nervous as to what that meant, because if you're wanting to unite all the people of the world who are communists, are you uniting them to go against the capitalist? So that quickly sets the stage for this battle. And you can see behind me, there's Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, and there's JFK, the American president. And I'm going to talk about this cartoon here as we go. But this political cartoon sets up, well, they're arm wrestling, right? There's this battle, and notice what they're sitting on. They're sitting on nuclear weapons. So remember out of World War II, and by the way, there is this really interesting moment. Have any of y'all seen the movie Patton? Like, young people don't really watch Patton, I get it. Like, it comes on AMC, it's really long. It's like 3.5 hours long movie. It's about General Patton, and he was really a rough guy. He infamously was reprimanded by the military because he saw a soldier in the hospital who is suffering from shell shock, which honestly today, really, when they called it shell shock, what are we probably talking about? What were they dealing with?
It was PTSD in a nutshell.
Yeah, it was PTSD. They just didn't know what to call it, right? And so they called it shell shock, that this would happen to them. So what ended up happening was when they were in this state, a lot of times, like, your older soldiers were like, they're just wussing out, they don't want to go to war. And so he goes into the military hospital from a soldier that's suffering from this and slaps him in the face and says, I don't know, you're just a coward. Why aren't you out there fighting? Now, this is like, nowadays we look at that and go, what? Why would you do that? But he was just a really hard-nosed guy. But he warned after World War II that there's this really short moment where the Russians don't have nukes. The Americans are the only people who have nuclear weapons, and that the Americans should go and destroy the Russians before they get nukes. Now, most people are like, hey, we are tired of fighting wars. Why? We do not want another war. But it is an interesting concept, because guess what happens very quickly in the 1950s? The Russians developed their own nuclear weapons. So now there is this battle that can't be fought like it normally was fought. Now, why can't they line up and fight each other? Why can't we just have this, that's what we did in World War II. That's what we did in World War I. That's what we did in the Civil War.
The controversial part of Patton was he after the German army was defeated, he wanted to rearm the German army and then go after the Russians.
Right. So why don't they just square up and fight? And again, notice back to the political cartoon, guys. Until 1945, yeah, sure, go fight each other. But when you have nuclear weapons, it's a whole other ballgame. Because you can drop one of these bad boys on a city, and several 100,000 people are dead. Not soldiers off fighting in a war, but innocent civilians. You could destroy an entire city with these things. So this is where the Cold War comes into play. They call it the Cold War because they used to talk about the heat of war, of like, a battle is hot, is kind of the reference there. The Cold War, they're not going to fight directly. Because if they fought directly, they would pull out these nuclear weapons and potentially destroy most of mankind. So what instead they did was they fought proxy wars. So the United States would fund, the South Koreans, and the Russians would fund the North Koreans, and those two groups would fight, kind of an indirect fighting. And then they had these negotiations, and that's where you saw the Cuban Missile Crisis and some of those events where they don't really want to go head-to-head because of that threat of nuclear weapons. So it does go back to Coach Hampton's point there about, Patton kind of, I will give him that. As harsh as he was, he did kind of foresee, once they have nuclear weapons, This is a whole different ballgame, and we really need to strike now if we think they're that dangerous. But that's a big debate that's going on to set up this question, which is, how dangerous is communism? Is communism simply the belief that government should look different, that it should be, that it should provide more equity to workers, it should raise the workers' class up higher to empower them and help them take over, and so you have this, the wealthy and the workers are here side by side? Or is there a bigger revolution that it requires, right? That can communism and capitalism, can communism and democracy coexist? So I kind of want you to even think about that, because I'd like to talk about that at the end of the call too, because we have a modern country that kind of toys with that. China kind of plays with that. They have some democratic values and they have some communist values, and they've kind of intertwined the two. And sometimes that creates a lot of difficulties, but they're an interesting experiment in how that works. In the 1940s, early 1950s, most people don't think there's any compatibility, that they can't go together. So that sets up the question for the day. Let me get the DBQ pulled up. So this is from back in 2001. The question here, let me get my little notebook up and ready. The question here is, what were the Cold War fears of the American people in the aftermath of the Second World War? How successfully did the administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower address these fears? Use the documents in your knowledge of the years 1948 to 1961 to construct your responses. Okay, so now the one thing I want to show you guys here is, when you're looking at this, they've asked you two things, okay? Number one, what were the fears, okay? So remember, as we're setting these up and categorizing them, one of the body paragraphs I would put is the fears, okay? What are the fears after the Second World War? So fears after Second World War. The second body paragraph, they asked, how successfully did they address those fears? So my second body paragraph would be the successes they had in addressing those fears. And then my third body paragraph would be when they didn't have success. So the times they weren't successful dealing with those fears. Okay, so just from a simple setup, and again, just to kind of take it back, I want you to just, whenever you do these, the one biggest issue most students have is they run out of time. So that's why I try to help you guys in like just setting it up. So now as we're reading them, think, I need to find documents that show me what the fears were, which how they were successfully dealt with and how they were not successfully dealt with. So but we can just categorize them here as we go. So I would just group them instantly as we go. So as we read these, think, does this tell me about one of the fears, or does it tell me how the government successfully or unsuccessfully dealt with the fear? So let's look at source number one. Source number one. This is from a Dwight Eisenhower press conference, March 1954. There is too much hysteria. The world is suffering from a multiplicity of fears. We fear the men in the Kremlin. We fear what they will do to our friends around them. We are fearing that unwise investigators will do to us here at home as they try to combat subversion or bribery or deceit within. We fear depression. We fear the loss of jobs. All of these, with their impact on the humankind, makes us almost hysterically, and you find the hysterical reactions. So honestly, this is a great one to start with, because what does he do right here? He really lays out what their fears are, right? Their fears are what? So this is document A. Their fears are depression, loss of jobs, it says all of these with their impact on humankind make us almost hysterical, and you find hysterical reactions. So think about that too as we go forward, hysterical reaction. So I would put this in the first paragraph. This is just describing we don't know what he did to deal with these fears, right? This is just him telling us what the fears are. So I would put that in paragraph 1 as describing the fears. And remember, he's the president, and he is describing there the situation that people have right out of World War II. So now let's go back. That one's pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at document number II, document B. John Foster Dulles, he's the Secretary of State, 1954. So it is interesting that we got another one from the government. So remember, when we think about point of view, we had the first one from the president, and now the second one is going to be from the Secretary of State. So this is again coming from the point of view of the government. If world communism captures any American state, however small, a new and perilous front is established, which will increase the danger to the entire free world and require even greater sacrifices from the American people. This situation in Guatemala has become so dangerous that the American states could not ignore it. At Caracas last March, the American states held their 10th Interim American Conference. They then adopted a momentous statement. They declared that domination or control of the political institutions of any American state by the communist movement would constitute a threat to the sovereignty and political independence of the American states, endangering the peace of America. Okay, I want you to think about that. Think about the way I prefaced this whole conversation today. There is a fear that even one state, if one state in America said, look, we want to have like a communist type government here, we want to look like this, the Secretary of State says that would endanger the entire country. Okay, so again, when we're looking at this, it's what I told you now. I think that the view of communism has changed some over time, but in this moment, they think that this is a threat to take over the entire country. So if they get in at all, if there's any kind of communism in America, it would be very dangerous. So again, document B, I don't know if that's really telling us anything. It's not really telling us how they reacted to it, right? It's not telling us how the government helped. It's not telling us if the government didn't help. It's just simply telling us that that was a fear, that the communists would take over a state. They would then use that to take over the whole country. So I would put that in the first paragraph again, but I would say this one is telling us the fear is that they will take over a state. By the way, how would communists take over a state? Like what do we see? How did the communists take over Russia? How did they take over China? How are they attempting to take over countries in Europe? Like what does that look like? Like what kind of takeover do you think they're fearful of? I think there's really two types of takeovers.
One is insurgency or a revolution through the people.
Absolutely. So like, think about Russia, 1917. Think about China, 1945. If they could literally come in and just steamroll the country, right? I mean, you could get a group of people that overthrow the government. That's one. Number two, you could like go win an election, right? I mean, like you could just literally become, like you could win. I mean, you could just say, hey, I think this is a better way of doing things. I want to be in government. Or you could lie and say, look, I'm not a communist, and I'm just a Democrat or a Republican, and get in office and go, haha, just kidding, I was a communist all along, and I'm going to do these things. So there's the fear that it could be aggressive, that it could be this violent revolution. And then two, there's also the fear that it could be something even more kind of sly behind the scenes. What's up, Antoine? That it could be something like that. So those are the kind of the fears there on what this could look like. So again, that's document B. I just want to remind you that there's really those two type of fears: revolution, like armed military, and then just like the silent. Has anybody watched The Americans? Like every reference I ever make pop culture, none of y'all ever get what I'm talking about. The Americans, it's like, are you familiar with the term sleeper cell? Or have you ever seen the movie The Siege? Ooh, The Siege with Denzel Washington. You ever seen that? Oh man, y'all gotta. What have y'all been doing? Like on quarantine, y'all should be watching these movies. They're awesome. So, okay, what a sleeper cell is, and this is what really scared people, is that the communists would send over a group of people. I mean, like when they're like 20 years old, and just say, hey, you just act normal until you get a call from us. And the code word is like train car. And so these people, they will come to America, they'd get married, they'd have kids, they would work, and they're an engineer, they're blah, blah, blah. And then 20 years later, they get a phone call, and then some Russian guy going, train car. And that means boom, it's time to turn into a spy. It's time to try to overthrow the government. So for 20 years, they haven't done anything. They haven't had contact with the Russian government. They haven't done anything nefarious, but that's why I call them a sleeper cell. They're literally doing nothing until they get the phone call, and it can be decades. And then boom, they jump into action. And they absolutely did this. I mean, there were times that this happened. So that scared people to death, that there could be these people in our government that are working for the Russians, but they are sleeper cells, so they don't even do anything until they get that phone call. So that's another scary concept that people are dealing with when they're thinking about them taking over the government. So let's take a look at source number 3, document C. So it's a picture here, and it doesn't tell you what this is, but it's in Life magazine, 1955. This might look like some of you guys here on kind of this quarantine right now. Like, they got their canned food, they've got canned water, they've got a alarm clock there. I guess that's what that is there. Looks like an alarm clock to me. Bunk beds there. What are they doing? Hopefully that's not what it looks like for you, because that would not be fun to stay in that very long. That looks like probably us in Oklahoma would call a storm shelter. But they're not using it to keep them safe from a storm. That's actually in the 1950s. That's a bomb shelter, okay? So what kind of bomb are they fearful of? You look back to the picture behind me, right? They're fearful of a nuclear attack. So we had Americans that were fearful that they would be attacked through nuclear weapons. So now, by the way, also, I want you to think about this. Number one, this does show a way that the government responded, right? They told people they needed to build these bunkers. So first of all, I think you could put this in the first paragraph as describing the fear that we could be attacked using nukes. I also think if you wanted to use this evidence to show like a response, right? That, yeah, we use bomb shelters to make sure people were protected from a nuclear blast. But let me ask you this. You think that bomb shelter does protect you from a nuclear blast? I mean, if you watch the new Indiana Jones movie, you would think you could get in a refrigerator and it would save you from a nuclear blast. But I guess that's just him. But yeah, he literally is in a refrigerator and a nuclear bomb hits and it like throws the refrigerator and then he just like jumps out and he's fine. So don't forget, a nuclear bomb, the blast itself is just half of the problem. The other half is the nuclear radiation. And again, I'm full of pop culture references that nobody gets, but there's a movie called Chernobyl that deals with just a nuclear meltdown in Russia that occurs in the early 80s. But that nuclear radiation is so lethal that if you survived a blast, but you were within several mile radius, chances are that you would be dead within a few weeks from radiation. So yes, it's good to have a bomb shelter because, yeah, I mean, if a nuclear bomb went off a few miles away and there was all this rubble and stuff, it would protect me. But I'm telling you,
Chernobyl was 86.
86. Okay, thank you. If a bomb dropped though within a mile or so of your house, guys, that bomb shelter is probably not going to do you a lot of good. But so again, if you wanted to argue it was a good thing because it kept people safe from that type of debris, or if you wanted to argue that, hey, look, honestly, this might not be this really helpful thing, right? That you would still potentially perish. Guys, there's that duck and cover video that again, I was able to show some of the classes, but you know, they said, hey, if you're a kid and you see a bright flash outside, cover the back of your neck because it's an atomic bomb. And think about that, guys. If you see the flash, like if you're outside and that nuke hits and you can see the flash, covering the back of your neck isn't going to do much because if you can see the flash, you're probably going to be vaporized. But that was a video they showed to kids in school to like make them feel better. But again, it wasn't at the time, some of that they knew. But guys, remember, most people didn't have any understanding of how bad the nuclear weapons were. They saw some pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but that's it. So they really didn't fully grasp how bad of a blast we're talking about there. So again, I think you can use this source in all three paragraphs. Just depends on how you want to argue that. Let's scroll down to document D. So this is the Saturday Evening Post. So again, just giving you a little bit of context to this. So this is a pretty popular magazine. So this is pretty well read. It's not overly political. It's kind of, the basic type of magazine, just getting information out there. So they're not like left wing or right wing or anything like that. On last June 29th, with President Roosevelt's signature, one of the most astounding pieces in legislation, pieces of legislation in history quietly became a law. Public Law 627 represents such a monumental conception of national public works that its accomplishment will literally dwarf any previous work of man. That new title, the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, tells the story of the road network which will receive the major portion of the brave new effort to get this country out of its national traffic jam. The interstate system is the 40,000-mile network of existing roads which comprise our truck line highways, and it connects 209 of the 237 cities having a population of 50,000 or more, and serves as the country's principal and industrial defense areas. Okay, a lot of reading to say what? What did President Roosevelt do with the Interstate Highways Act here? What did he connect? He gave it the largest cities with a network of interstate highways. Now, let me just tell you guys, the Millwood students will get this. McAllister, Enid, Ponca City students, I think you will too. But if you're going down I-40, 270, interstate highways, you can keep going as long as you want. You have to exit to get off the highway, okay? Now, if you're from a smaller town, guess what happens when you're going down like a state highway? When you get to a city, you have to stop at the red light, and you got to stop at another red light. Most old highways used to go through cities and make you stop. If you're familiar with Route 66, of course, that's an Oklahoma staple around here. But again, it was a highway it curved, it went through cities. So when people used to travel, they would stop and go to the city, then they would go to the next city and stop and go to the city. Now, guys, think about how long that would take you, though. If you're driving down the highway at 55 miles an hour, and every city you came to, the highway literally had a red light and you stopped. Now, what Eisenhower did was he passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which allowed this interstate highway system to connect all the way across the country. And if you want to get off the highway, you got to exit to get off the highway. It doesn't stop. It keeps going. Now, guys, what this does, now, by the way, what does that have to do with defense? What does that have to do with anything else we've talked about today? That's another thing I need to probably make sure that I say to you guys. You might be reading through some of this and come to a source and say, what does that have? That's completely different than the other stuff that I've seen. Well, that's where, again, I want you to think through it and try to figure out, it has a connection, I promise. They're not throwing something out there that doesn't have a connection. So why are they talking to us about the Interstate Commerce Act when we're talking about Cold War fears and how we responded to it? Anybody want to handle that? Anybody know where? Here you go. We're going to go way back. The first roads in the United States were created to connect what? Does anybody know the answer to that? The first roads in the United States were created to connect what? Forts. The military wanted a quick way. After we have first official roads, okay, that I'm talking about commission, they went out and they cut through forests to create roads, were created to connect our forts. So our first kind of project in creating large road system was to connect forts. As a matter of fact, you can go back to ancient Rome. That was why ancient Rome wanted to build roads all over their empire. The reason Eisenhower, and this is kind of strange to think about today, because now with airplanes and the ability of air travel and our ICBMs, it doesn't matter as much. But back then, it was to quickly move defense materials across the country. So if you wanted to create bombs over here and you wanted to get ammunition to this base and you wanted to do this and that, he wanted those things to be able to move quickly. So that's why part of the reason they identified these 200 major cities, and they're able to move those things rather quickly. Now again, you guys live in a completely different world where with the use of air travel, and also, guys, you also have to remember back then, most nuclear weapons you could only shoot 20 to 30 miles away. But then in the 1960s, we get ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that can go across the world. I mean, right now we can shoot a nuclear weapon from a submarine and hit a country hundreds of miles away. So, but that didn't exist in the 1950s. So again, all of these type of strategic investments were to help move military goods across the country. So that would be a reaction, right? That would be the way the government dealt with it. And so I would say that was successful, right? I mean, like most people today really love the interstate highways. It made people feel safer. It helped us move materials across the country. So I would put D, that's a reaction. And that is a success in how we dealt with it. Okay. Let's take a look at document E. So here we go. U.S. News and World Report, December 1957, a little bit later, okay? It says, must U.S. take the first blow? The problem of massive retaliation in the missile age. In today's bomber age, it's 10 hours from Soviet bases to American cities. Warning systems can alert defenses, blunt any attack. American bombers on bases ringing Soviet Russia, alerted, can strike in massive retaliation. The result's a stalemate. In tomorrow's missile age, it's to be 35 minutes at most from Soviet missile bases to any point in the U.S. Warning systems will be able to give you no time before the blow fails. Push a button in Russia and 35 minutes later, much of the U.S. could be laid waste with power to retaliate limited. The result, a growing question of whether a policy of accepting first blow may be the best one. So that's a really scary thought for people in the 1950s, that because of how good the technology is getting, there's really no warning. Again, I'm gonna just throwing out a bunch of pop culture references that if you've never seen Dr. Strangelove's How I Love to Build the Bomb, How I Learned to Love the Bomb, it's really, it's satire. It's meant to be funny. It's by Stanley Kubrick, the famous director that did The Shining. But it's about like how crazy this was, that if you push a button in Soviet Russia, that by the late 1950s, you could have bombers in the air, you could have nuclear submarines that could fire a missile, and within an hour, half the United States could be destroyed, and vice versa. So what they're questioning here is, can America continue to say, hey, if you hit us with nuclear weapons, we're going to retaliate by doing blah? Because guess what? If you take a hit like that, it's not like other battles. I mean, like if you get attacked before this point, someone attacks one of your ships or they launch an invasion, you react to that, right? But what about if someone launches an attack and kills half of the people in your country? Like, what is there left to retaliate with? So the question there is like, do we need to completely rethink like our strategy? I mean, like, what are we going to do if we one day wake up and we hear the sirens going off and that means you got 30 minutes left to live? What can we do? So I would say document E is a great example of us not being successful, okay? That we don't have enough technology or enough warning to make people feel comfortable with that. This is where you begin to see people in the late 50s have this real fear of, at any moment, and this is where you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is where you see, and again, I've mentioned to you guys about JFK before, that JFK is really viewed as this great leader, even though he's only president for 2.5 years. But part of the reason is because he's navigating this time where people are really, really scared about what this means. That could you wake up one day and not see your kids because, you know, they get blown up? Is this a real possibility? As a matter of fact, in 1964, when Lyndon Johnson wins his election, that's basically, he runs an ad that says, yeah, if you're not careful, we could all be blown up. That's how bad this can be. So it's this really scary time that people are trying to navigate, and they don't feel like we have a great response ready as we're going into the 1960s. That's at least with that source E. It's showing there. So that's one of our first negative sources. Now let's look at document F here. Oh, let's see where it said. Okay, it didn't give you any information on where it was from. Oh, I'm sorry, never mind. They took this one off. I forgot about that. Some library won't let them reprint that anymore. Okay. Document G is a special message to Congress from President Eisenhower on education. Because of the national security interest in the quality and scope of our education system in the years immediately ahead, however, the federal government must also undertake to play an emergency role. The administration is therefore recommending certain emergency federal action to encourage and assist greater effort in specific areas of national concern. These recommendations place principal emphasis on our national security requirements. If we are to maintain our position of leadership, we must see to it that today's people are prepared to contribute the maximum to our future progress. Because of the growing importance of science and technology, we must necessarily give special, but by no means exclusive attention to education in science and engineering. So that's another reaction. Okay, now, honestly, you guys can speak to this really well, right? Like, he wants a new investment in our education system to help us keep up with the engineering requirements that are needed to produce this type of weaponry and technology to compete with the Russians. So was it successful? I think you could argue it both ways, right? I think there's an argument that it did help to place more of an emphasis on that type of education. I also think you could point to that it wasn't enough, that it wasn't strategic enough, that we still were lagging behind in parts of our education system. So again, I think you can make an argument either way there. So let's just do the negative. We'll say that they tried to help educate people and in a faster way on engineering needs, but still had a tough time keeping up. Let's do one more and then I'll put them together here in the essay because we have a little chart. I love the charts. Historical Statistics of the United States, Statistical Abstract of the United States Department of Commerce. Okay, so we were talking about this yesterday. There is your life expectancy, okay? And notice what I talked about is, notice we start seeing in the late 40s the growth there of life expectancy. So we're starting to tick up. So this is closer to what we were today than when we were talking yesterday about the 1920s, it being down in the low 60s. We see the jump to the late 60s. We see the gross national product. Notice it continues to increase over the years. Look at the total government spending. Look at that jump from 51 to 53. We went from $45 billion in spending to 76, so nearly, not quite double, but pretty close. At surplus, we had a $1 billion surplus, then a $7 billion surplus. So you see the economy really gets going there. And then you have some other numbers there as well. Defense spending as percentage of government spending. Look at that jump from 1949 to 1951. So a jump from 32% of our money is spent on defense to 51. So again, what are we trying to show? What are they showing you there? They're showing you that one of the responses, we'll call this we can call it a positive response. One of the positive responses is we spent more on the military to help prepare. I think you could argue that both ways, right? You could say, well, that's good. It helped us beef up our military so we could respond to the Russians. Eisenhower is very critical of it when he leaves the presidency. He says, look, I think we're spending too much. Like, you want to have, let me just ask you guys this question. How many nukes do you need? Right? You need enough nukes to destroy Russia. Okay, well, what about when you have enough nukes to destroy like everyone in the world? Do you just keep going? Do you just keep building more nukes? Like, why? Like, at what point do you have enough nukes? And I say that because there is a danger in creating too many nukes. Because first of all, number one, every time you create a nuke, you got to test the new type of nuke. So hydrogen bombs are created in the 1950s, so those are out there now too. Every single time you test one, you have released a ton of radiation into the air. Okay, 10 times more radiation than what's given out by the sun. Okay, so every time you test one, you're shooting radiation in the air. Now, what does that mean? Now, guess what? still, of course, you guys know, I'm not a scientist. I don't know much about science, but I do know that there's some detrimental effects to that. People still argue today how much of that radiation in our atmosphere causes some types of cancer. What are the hole in the ozone layer? What else is sending all this radiation in the air doing? I don't know, and scientists don't know either. And back then, a lot of scientists are saying, guys, we don't know what this is doing to the world around us. So that's bad. Number two, what if you lose one of these nuclear weapons? In the late 1960s, part of what we see starting to occur is we see terrorist groups popping up in the Middle East. We see some of these bad Soviet actors in Eastern Europe that want nuclear weapons as well. And so what if one of them get a nuclear weapon? I'm sure you guys have heard that before, with America being so frustrated with Iran in the last 10 years. Part of the reason is their nuclear proliferation. If they get a nuke, are they the type of people that say, hey, we don't want to use it because you might nuke us back? Or especially in the past, did they have a leader that was crazy enough that he didn't care? That, hey, if you nuke me back, whatever. I'm doing this for kind of this religious purpose, so I don't really care if you nuke me back or not. So that's always kind of the danger there with if you lose nuclear weapons and they start getting out there. So let's put this together. Again, I know that we've walked through this a few times now, so hopefully remember as I started today, I want to take you through how we could do context leading up to the Cold War. I would say at the end, because remember, this is context. So what was leading up to the Cold War? At the end of World War II, we see the Americans and the Russians become enemies. Throughout the war, they were allies, but because of the communist aspirations of the Russians, the Americans believed they would be an existential enemy. By existential, I mean only one can exist, and there's several U.S. diplomats that believe that they will never stop till we're destroyed. So, and by the way, that is, again, we can go deeper with this if you guys wanted to, but there is some troubling aspects to that thought. They might be right? So first of all, if you think that somebody believes that you cannot both live together, that there can only be one, that means that they believe they have to destroy you. So then if you believe that, your reaction is probably what? I got to destroy them. I don't have any other, I got to destroy them. But the bad thing is, now they might be correct. The Russians might believe that. But what if they don't? Right? What if they have some strategic interest? But if you believe that, now look at how belligerent you've become. So it's a dangerous thought process. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong, because you might be correct. The Russians might be, and different Russian leaders did have a more aggressive thought process there. But again, when you look at that, that is the way it's viewed at that point in time, that they are an existential threat, that they want to destroy America because they don't think that we can live together. Okay, so that's how I'm starting the essay. That gives context. Notice I use phrases like communism, existential enemy, and that they were allies. They were literally, that was the term. They were the allies versus the Axis in World War II. So I gave specifics there so that the reader would know that I knew what was going on before this. In my thesis statement, remember X, however, A, B, therefore Y. So that goes something like this. Let's see. We talked about the fears. Some of the fears that Americans had during the Cold War were, we could do that communists would take over the government. I can't spell government. And there could be an economic crisis. However, the U.S. government did successfully comfort Americans by building interstate highways and encouraging the use of bomb shelters. Also, the Americans, let's do it like this. The Americans, though, failed in creating an education system that allowed for innovation that would protect all Americans. Therefore, the U.S. had mixed results in reacting to the fears of Americans. Yeah, that's your first paragraph right there, okay? And then remember your body paragraphs, you'd write one about all the fears. I would list them all out, like loss of jobs, like a violent overthrow, like a taking over of the government. I would then say how we dealt with it. I would go into detail about why those interstate highways were helpful, why bomb shelters were helpful. I would then talk about what were the negatives, okay, how they didn't. Talk about how education did not have technology that was going to be really helpful. Also talk about how bomb shelters didn't save you if a nuclear bomb was dropped right on you. You can also talk about how they didn't do anything to keep the states from being taken over. So again, that fear was still out there. And then I would end it with that last paragraph, talk about what happened post-Cold War. So what ends up happening is there is no major war with the Russians. And so slowly over time, people began to realize that nuclear war was not going to be a reality. So we begin to see the second Red Scare dissipate. I mean, you don't see much of an issue with it going forward. So again, this will be the last time we kind of walk through one like this. Again, I've got some other things I want to kind of throw at you guys over the next few times that we have class, so that we've kind of talked in broader terms about them. I hope it's been helpful to just write some thesis statements with you guys, to just walk you kind of through that process. And so now you've seen, that makes it 6 times now we've done a DBQ together. So you've seen the way these documents, I mean, again, there's nothing crazy about them, right? I mean, they all kind of look the same. You always kind of get a graph. You always kind of get a map. You always get like a speech. I mean, like it's kind of the same layout every time. So the good thing is you guys can know that. I mean, you can feel comfortable in knowing kind of the documents you're going to get. The bad thing is they don't tell you the time period they're going to ask you about or the topic. So that's why we have to kind of keep talking about the broader themes like I've tried to do, to just make sure if there's anything you've forgotten, I'm trying to bring that back to your memory there as we're leading up to the test. So do you guys have any questions or comments for me on that? Well, guys, I appreciate your attention. I hope, like I said, I hope this is helpful. If you guys do have any questions for me, please feel free to shoot me an email. And we'll continue this tomorrow at the same time, 3 o'clock. Like I said, we're going to do something a little different tomorrow. I'm going to kind of surprise you with that tomorrow. I'm hoping there's I might have a special guest on here with us tomorrow. I'll email you guys if that does work out. But we're going to talk about some of these bigger themes. And I'm going to continue to give you guys some feedback on how to answer these type of questions. So thank you all for joining today. I hope you guys have a good one. Antoine, I hope you're safe there in the car. So please be careful. And you guys
I just left the car dealership.
Okay. Gotcha. Nice. So what are you going to get?
Oh, I already have a car. I was helping my grandma.
Oh, you're a good man, Antoine. You're a good man. All right, guys. Well, I'll let you guys go for the rest of the day, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right.